Good evening, and welcome to the show. This is the First Amendment, historically speaking. I will be your host. My name is Brother Frederick Douglass Dixon, and we have a very special guest today. And before we get to the guest, as always, we'd like to thank UPTV for all their diligence and them allowing us to have this platform to come before you and forward what we think is esoteric information that will hopefully enlighten and start in the home, which will stretch to the community and the larger society. So again, we'd like to thank UPTV and their entire staff. They've been more than just professional. They've been great friends. So today, as we continue with our ability to talk about things that are not normally talked about in so many circles, it would behoove me to not introduce you to this young man that we have here today. What I have here today is Brother Khalid El-Hakim, who is indeed a warrior for his science, and he's indeed a scientist. So we're going to talk about what he does, but just to let you all know, he's a great scholar, and on top of that, he's a really good friend. So to introduce him to the world through the First Amendment, historically speaking, it is indeed our guest. So again, I'd like to thank my dear brother, Brother Khalid El-Hakim. Thank you for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Brother Fred.
It's taken so very long for us
to
get these dates correct. But before we go any further, I would like to have you tell exactly what you do, and let's move on to what you're doing now. But give us an overview, if you will.
Well, I'm the founder of the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, which is a collection of over 7,000 artifacts of original memorabilia of items that date from slavery to hip-hop culture. And I've been collecting these artifacts for about 25 years now, and pretty much traveling the country, displaying them, giving lectures on Black history, and really looking at displaying artifacts in a non-traditional type of way and engaging the public in a non-traditional type of way.
So when we begin to talk about it being proper, we've been taught that we should start at the beginning.
Yes, sir.
So how did this become not a hobby? How does this not become something that folks would coin a passion, but how does this become your life's work?
Well, this became my life's work by starting off really taking a sociology class in undergrad back in the early 90s. And there was a professor by the name of David Pilgrim who started the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia at Ferris State University in Michigan. And he had a very unique way of teaching students about racism in America. He would bring in artifacts in the class and use these objects to teach about hatred, about intolerance in American history. So from there, I was inspired to start collecting. I didn't know, first of all, I didn't know these objects even existed prior to taking that class. And shortly after that class, I started combing through antique shops in northern Michigan and actually finding these objects, things such as sample jars or racist cookie jars that were created, or postcards that had lynchings and that type of memorabilia. But it was very disturbing to see, but it's a very necessary part of history to teach. So I just thought it was a very unique way of teaching a history that's not being taught in the public school system or elsewhere.
Very interesting. So when I hear you continue to mention the state of Michigan, where are you from, dear brother?
I'm from Detroit, born and raised in Detroit, product of the Detroit public schools. Actually, after I graduated from undergrad, I went back to the Detroit public schools and taught social studies for just about 15 years. And
very interesting.
Yeah.
When we think about Detroit, most folks think about Ford Motor Company. Lots of folks think about Motown.
Right.
But I think about the booming times of Detroit. And I also think about the disenfranchisement that has gone on since. So you living through that area.
Right.
And now you bringing things back to, if you will, supplement and correct some of that education that is not really seen. That's a great responsibility. So what do you think as far as your responsibility, how does that tie into what you're doing right now?
Well, being a Detroiter was a very unique experience growing up as a black man in Detroit in the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. And the reason being is that I always grew up just with my peers as well, seeing black men and women in positions of power. So we've had mayors, city council people, everybody from the school board to superintendents to teachers to police chiefs. My whole life, we saw black people in positions of power. So I think in terms of my self-identity and self-esteem, I think, it was a blessing to have that and to be able to see that. So, but Detroit had, has had its, ups and downs, but growing up in Detroit, in terms of self-esteem, it was pretty solid because I think because of seeing those people in positions of power. But the 70s, 80s brought in, economic downturn in terms of the automotive industry. On top of that, you had the crack epidemic of the 80s, and now, you have a big thing with heroin and abandoned homes in Detroit, and it's been rough for Detroiters.
Well, Detroit has always been a haven for black thought.
Yes, sir.
Through exactly what you're saying, these individuals who have been forever raising the consciousness nationally and internationally in Detroit cannot be lessened in the history of America. And when I think about Detroit, being from Chicago, I'll say this. My grandmother, she was one of three. Her other two sisters stayed in Detroit. Wow. And they were all chased from Rosewood. So just to understand, to have that connection, as a child, I would always travel to Detroit. So I understand that, but for those people who don't understand, Detroit is very rich. And even in Chicago, there was always a connection from the South Side and the West Side to Gary, Indiana.
Right.
And so we felt that connection with Detroit as well, because Chicago is so large that you could look at the South Side as being literally an all-black area.
Exactly.
So those things do reverberate when we think about some of the things that make us successful, some of the challenges that we've had. But when I begin to think about three particular entities and their importance, I'd like for you to give me your thoughts on them. But when we think about raising the consciousness of youths, all youths, but more specifically, young black youths who are overwhelmed with Western education, at best. And some would call it a miseducation, as Dr. Carter G. Woodson did in 1933. But what I would like to do with these three entities, and I need to name them, the first entity would be museums, African American cultural centers, and then African American Studies Department. All of these have unique beginnings, and if we look at their beginnings and we look at them now, they seem so far removed from some of the fundamental objectives that were put forth and how these things came to be. So when you think about museums, I have to say that I have a unique connection with the DuSable Museum of African American History. And what I'll say about that particular place is there was always a huge potential in it being more than what I would say it is now. So a wise man told me potential delayed is potential denied. And that's the way I look at some museums. But I've grown to know you as a person as well as your museum and your potential. Not only are you reaching it, but it seems unlimited. So how do you feel about museums in the idea of raising the masses culture?
I think if we go back to the pioneers of the Black Museum movement in the 1960s, when we look at Dr. Margaret Burroughs of Chicago with the DuSable and Dr. Charles Wright, he started the I Am Museum in the 1960s that is now known as the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. If we look at those two pioneers in particular, and there were others, but if we look at those two particular, because those two in particular inspired me, along with Arthur Schomburg of Harlem as well. I grew up going to the Charles Wright Museum, the original museum, which was on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. And I remember the cultural, with the neighborhood connection and the community connection that he had, which the DuSable started off in the same way. And if my history is correct, Dr. Margaret Burroughs started the DuSable, or a version of the DuSable, in a carriage house behind where she was living.
Indeed.
And knowing that that major museums, mainstream museums, were not talking about our history and really omitting or distorting our history when we were even exhibited or displayed in those museums at all, it was a distortion of our contribution. We took it upon ourselves. Dr. Burroughs, Dr. Charles Wright took it upon themselves to collect objects from Africa, objects that represented our contributions and our achievements, and to share those directly with the community. All right, so looking at those humble beginnings is what really inspired me, and knowing that at this point in time, some museums have not followed through with maintaining those type of commitments to the community. Now, when we look at educational outreach programs, I think that is probably the number one issue and number one thing that museums must do in order to stay engaged with the community. If you don't have an active educational outreach program,
yes,
that's a big challenge. But I think we have to go back and rethink how these pioneers engaged our communities. And that's one thing that I've tried to do with the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, is look at how I engage the community and make sure that the exhibits are right in front of the people. And no matter where the people are, we take the exhibit straight to them. So it could be in someone's living room. It could be on a major university campus, or it could be at a cultural center or a fair, or just anywhere the people are. Because one of the major challenges that I think most museum people would agree with is the challenge of bringing people into the brick and mortar museums. And one way that you do that is by creating opportunities for them to see that material outside of that traditional type of space. And you invite people in once they see the objects that you have within your archive. So, take things out to the community, show people what you have, and encourage them to come in and support.
Which is indeed indispensable. That's a duty that's indispensable.
Mm-hmm.
So where we fall short sometimes is that we become, with our own history, we become co-opted with philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
We become co-opted with our own arrogance, ego, and vanity.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at museums, and then I look at African American cultural centers,
mm-hmm.
another entity that I'd like to discuss very briefly, in my own travels, when I've run into African American cultural centers, it just seems that they're more, in this day and time,
mm-hmm.
they have become more of a place for party, more of a place for show, more of a place for intelligent conversation that perhaps doesn't even touch the thrust of the problem of what goes on in the community.
Right.
So I think that between those, it becomes very important that we not only become very critical about it, but we have to look to who's financing,
mm-hmm.
under what thought does this take place, and then what are our leaders who are in control of these particular institutions. Because a wise man once said, and he was talking about museums and cultural centers, he said, it's absolutely no mistake, it's absolutely by no mistake that all the wrong people are in control of our institutions. So I look at it very critically, and when I think about African American cultural centers, I've even traveled with you to some of these places and watched the transformation of our young people as they see these artifacts, as you discuss them, as you put forth esoteric information. And I think it's life-changing. But what do we do to consistently follow up and have them understand that just because it's not in your book, just because your teacher won't be able to explain it, then what you do with the mobile museum as far as bringing it to them becomes literally what fills the gaps.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that we have to realize and understand without a doubt is that these institutions were born out of struggle. These were not things that were given to us, but these were born out of the struggle of our people. And if you miss that point and you don't reaffirm and recommit yourself to that struggle, then you're going to go off the path. and then things of philanthropy or more concern of getting grants or just whatever else becomes a focus, and we miss the idea that look, we have this was born out of struggle. We have to recommit, rededicate ourselves to the community, depend upon the community to support us, and so you don't get in a position. I know a few museums where they've been in situations where the doors were almost closed because of support. But if you've missed the opportunity to maintain relationships with the community, then you miss out on having a base of support that's consistent. So I remember being an elementary school student and being so excited when Charles Wright went out and started the Buy a Brick program for the Charles Wright Museum. And being in elementary school and knowing that my little pennies, my little dimes and nickels and little dollars were going to actually buy a brick that was going to be a part of this brick and mortar museum, I was excited about that. And it was because of that seed being dropped back then that I knew that, a museum like the Charles Wright Museum, or even a museum that I decided to start myself, that comes out of that legacy of knowing that struggle, knowing that support, and having that commitment that these artifacts, these stories, this narrative is important for our people.
Agreed. I think you used an excellent term when you talk about legacy, because obviously someone allowed for you to be able to absorb the importance of this paradigm. And I think that right now, today, our young population finds our history to be very exciting. But sometimes we don't present it that way, or sometimes we don't have those connections,
Right.
or we're not charismatic enough, or we're too much caught up into the old school thoughts to even connect with that group.
Right.
Because we're still talking about the difference between accurate information and that mysterious information, or as that book says, the lies my history teacher told.
Right.
So I think that when we talk about today's population, I don't think we give them credit enough for them being interested in their own history, because we have literally said that they're not, which is indeed not true. What are
Right.
your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are this. There hasn't been one place that I've traveled throughout the country where the students have not been engaged in these artifacts. It's all about presentation. It's all about how you present this material to the students. We have to pay attention to what they are interested in. So many of the students are very knowledgeable on hip hop culture, and they participate in hip hop culture. So if they walk through an exhibit and see Tupac represented, that's an incredible opportunity to talk about someone that they relate to up front, and then use him as an opening to talk about his mother, the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X being influencing the Black Panther Party. If you talk about Malcolm, we have to talk about Nation of Islam. If we talk about Malcolm and the Nation of Islam, we have to talk about Marcus Garvey. All right, and so just having a conversation about Tupac, we take them all the way back to somebody like Marcus Garvey. All right, and right there, you have a bunch of individuals right there, eras of people and organizations that are not talked about at all in the public school system. So where else would our students get that type of information, right? So that's one way that we use these artifacts to have those type of discussions.
I think that what moves me every time that I'm able to travel with you or look at the museum for itself, it's always something different that takes me and grinds me back to what I consider to be one point in history, maybe a flagship here, maybe a thought that sparks here.
Right.
So when I begin to look, it was yesterday, and you had a Sports Illustrated from 1974, which was the Rumble in the Jungle between
Right.
Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. And I'm pretty interested in sports and have been all that time, so I can remember that time. So it took me back to that time. But as I looked at the top of the Sports Illustrated, that particular article, that particular issue, there was an article in about pro basketball. That was the pro basketball article. That was the issue for pro basketball for 74 and 75.
Okay.
So
Wow.
I can say in 74 and 75, the Bulls, being a Bulls fan, they were still in the Western Conference.
Right.
So these are definitely conversations that we can talk about with our young people.
Right.
Because not only are they interested, if you have enough insight or willing to listen to what they're interested in, the actual artifact becomes not just a teaching moment, this is proof.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's proof, and it allows us to take our our knowledge that we have already and build upon that. So if you had that knowledge of the Bulls already, we're taking that and we're building upon that. So any student that walks through the exhibit, you're going to see something that's going to spark your interest based upon the prior knowledge that you have. And that's all we want to do is find out where you are. Let's begin where you are and build upon that. So if the rumble in the jungle sparks your interest, let's start a conversation right there, and just build upon that. So, as a curator, I find information out all the time that I didn't see, that I didn't know. And I'm very familiar with all the artifacts in there, but someone comes in with a certain prior knowledge, they'll see something that I haven't seen. So I'm always learning just as much as the folks who walk through it.
And it's very important for one who's going to forward information as a teacher, if you will,
Right.
to be a great student, because that's the way that we travel to become better off. I think that what you're doing is invaluable, and I know that for me as a historian, there's nothing, or John Hope Franklin said it better than I could. He said the essence of scholarship is truth.
Yes,
So when he
indeed.
says the essence of scholarship is truth, I think that when it comes to African American studies departments and how they look right now and how they're constantly under attack for autonomy, I think that even if we talk about the struggle that they come from, when we're talking about the Black Power movement, the Black Campus movement, the Black Student movement, and I think that we have gotten away
Right.
from those fundamental goals, and now what we see is it being co-opted by those who, they're bright people. There are some very brilliant people that we know, but it just seems to be along the way that what was gained has been overwhelmed by, when it comes to us, black people in general, we still look to have a justification for our thoughts, for our actions, our attitudes, and behaviors. So we can look at our BA, our Bachelor's of Arts. We can look at our MA, our Master's of Arts. We can look at our PhD, to prove to the rest of the world that we have learned this and we're able to regurgitate it. But the BA, the MS, and the PhD can all add up to BS
Right.
if we are not grounded in just what this struggle was about. And I think if you can talk about that struggle and how it ties into returning with these artifacts to that time, then that's a beautiful thought.
Yeah, I think the biggest struggle we have with Black Studies departments is unity amongst staff, amongst students, and promoting that struggle and that legacy that we just talked about. You just can't go and get a PhD or BA or BS or MA from a Black Studies department, get your degree and just keep it moving. We have to go back to the source. We have to go back, support it with our finances. We have to support it with demanding those same demands that we had back in the 60s are the same demands that we have in 2016. We still have to demand things from these universities. And it has to be consistent, and we have to go all out. Because the struggle continues. It shouldn't have never stopped because white supremacy hasn't stopped one bit. So we have to go back and support, and we have to go back and struggle and fight for those gains. Because like you said, there's been situations that have been co-opted, and all across the country, Black Studies departments are taking hits and they're closing. So, and we have to go back and gain that back.
I think it's very important for the museum to be a living, breathing fundamental element of our existence.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that you've covered so many different spaces on a given table that you use that will connect to a grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
a mother, a son, and a grandson.
Right.
And they're all able to understand the importance. So outside of just the importance, where do you find the support for you to keep moving and do this? Because as a young man, very young man,
Thank you,
you
sir.
have to realize that as tough as our situation is, because no matter how old we are all relatively young in our own mind, and
Right.
seeing what the days and times and what it means to be black, and there's this dehumanizing process
Right.
that has consistently gone along with the red, the white, and the blue. And I mean, how do you look at your role?
Well, I have not done this by myself, right? One thing that I've realized over time, and especially presenting the material that I present in these public spaces, is that many of the people that I present from the 60s, 70s, 80s are still around. So I've actually invited these individuals to come out on the road with me and speak. Why hear it from me when you or see the source in terms of an artifact and not get the full story with having someone come along the road with me? So for the past 25 or 20 years of traveling and displaying this material, I've had the last poets come out and speak and perform. I've had Sam Greenlee, who wrote The Spook Who Sat by the Door,
Classic.
who's come out many occasions and spoke. But for the past 10 years, I've had a soldier and a warrior commit himself to travel around the country with me, and that's no other than Professor Griff of Public Enemy,
Oh yes, sir.
who I met back in
Soldier.
2002 doing this work of uplifting the consciousness of our people. And he's been committed since 2006, touring nationally with the museum as we've traveled to over 25 states, 70 college campuses, K through 12 schools, libraries, religious institutions, all around the country, man. And he's been consistent. He's been, one of my biggest supporters. And as a matter of fact, right now we're shooting a documentary called Artifactual that's documenting the work that we've been doing.
We wish you luck with that
Yeah,
as
thank
well.
you.
If you could give us a summary about what you would like for people to understand when they see you and what it is that your goals are with this mobile museum.
Well, the number one goal is for people to recognize that history is important. Our Black history matters, right? So it's important for us to know that our story has not been told, and it's not going to be told properly in the curriculum, public school curriculums across the country. So we have to supplement that with the truth. We have to give them a broader perspective on what the history is. We cannot wait for our oppressor to teach us about our history. It's not going to happen. It's never happened. That's just not part of the agenda. So we have to know that our history matters. I want people to realize that we made contributions to the society that we've never been given credit for.
Yes, sir.
And that the attack on our lives has been consistent from day one. And it hasn't just been a physical attack. It has been an attack of image. And when you look at some of the artifacts, you'll see the attack and the brutality and how our images have been portrayed in artifacts that this society has created.
Excellent.
All right, so we have to talk about that, and I use these artifacts to have those discussions, and that's it. I want people to remember. This museum should be a time for us to remember who we are, what we are, and what we need to be in the future to make our society better, man.
Well, brother, your work is, as one would say, a valuable piece of what we need to complete our thoughts, raise our consciousness, and look to the very future. So may Allah continue to bless you in your and protect you and place His protective hedge around you. And the Mobile Museum, can you give us a number for it?
Yeah, so if you want to reach out to the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, the number is 313-645-4197, 313-645-4197. And you can reach me on Facebook, Khalid El Hakim, or the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, or my email is bhistory101@yahoo.com.
Well, brother, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Brother
and
Fred.
We thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, our dear brothers and sisters, this information may in no means change your life, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, a distinguished man of color, Brother Frederick Douglass Dixon. Run tell that.